Belarus across the globe in 9 languages, 24/7, online, FM and satellites. Radio Belarus International, bringing Belarus closer.
Mr. Tookhy, after 20 years, $1 trillion spent on military operation in Afghanistan, the US troops left the country. What are the two reasons for this hasty decision, as it may be even surprise for the US close allies?
Sure. So in order to understand the US decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, we have to go back to the beginning of the war and the main reason, the declared reason for the war that the United States made at the beginning back in 2001. The war in Afghanistan was a response to the terrorist attacks against the United States on 9/11 of 2001. The major reason for that war was to give a response to the perpetrators of the war and to punish them. At the time, Al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan, and the Taliban leadership refused to hand over Osama bin Laden. So that was the major reason for the US attack on Afghanistan. So the attack was really a response to a terrorist attack against the United States and had nothing to do with the state building in Afghanistan or the situation of governance in Afghanistan. The decision to withdraw was out there from really the middle years of the second decade of the war. You know that during the Obama presidency, there was a surge in US troops to eliminate and totally defeat the Taliban. That did not succeed. So the idea of withdrawing from Afghanistan was raised from the Obama years onwards. Initially, there was a troop drawdown in 2014, and it was supposed to be a complete withdrawal by 2016. That did not happen. It was not really a sudden decision. This ended up becoming the longest war in US history, but the idea of withdrawing was always there, especially during the second decade of the war. Eventually, it came down to the former US President Donald Trump to make a decision and to come to an agreement with the Taliban and set an exact date for withdrawing the US troops from Afghanistan, which was May the 21st. So the fact that this was the longest war in US history caused a lot of war fatigue within American society and political circles. The war had reached a stalemate, so by the middle years of this, really during the second decade of the war, there was a consensus in the US that military victory would not be achieved. On the issue of withdrawal, there was almost consensus, but on how to withdraw and with what pace and under what conditions, that was the issue over which there was no consensus.
And what impact could the latest events have on regional security, as there are fears that Afghanistan could turn once again into terrorist safe haven, as Taliban comprises different insurgent organizations and has strong ties with Al-Qaeda?
Sure. So the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan has created a shift in military balance of power in Afghanistan. For now, the Taliban are in control militarily, but a major issue for both Afghanistan and for regional countries is, as you mentioned, is the ties that the Taliban have with other extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These extremist groups are different, but at the same time, there is a lot of overlap between them. And the situation in Afghanistan is such that there is the possibility of members of these groups moving from one group to another, depending on the situation within these groups. So I think for regional countries, there are two major issues in post-US Afghanistan. One is as you mentioned, is the issue of international terrorist groups getting a haven once again in Afghanistan and posing threats to almost all regional countries, including Central Asia, and through them to Russia and other countries, China, Iran, and also Pakistan, despite the fact that Pakistan was and is a major supporter of the Taliban. So that's one issue, the issue of terrorist groups gaining a foothold in Afghanistan and posing threats to neighboring countries and beyond. The other issue is the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan and refugee crisis. If the situation in Afghanistan gets deteriorated, that could lead to a major humanitarian crisis in the country, and that could lead to further migration and refugee crises that can affect not only regional countries, but other countries like Europe and other places. So these are the two major issues that regional countries are dealing with right now. And that's why there are regional efforts to try and contain the situation in Afghanistan after the US withdrawal from the country.
During its year in power, Taliban enforced a strict Sharia law, but now the organization says that it would ensure women's and minority rights as well as cultural and religious traditions. Could we say that the ideology of Taliban has really changed, or this is just an attempt to create a new image?
I think the idea that the Taliban have changed is fundamentally mistaken. The ideology of the Taliban is a totalitarian ideology. It's a pre-modern totalitarian ideology, and you can see it from the composition of their interim government. It's completely composed of Taliban members and mostly from one ethnic group. So it's totalitarian group. It's an ethnocentric group. And therefore, the idea that they have changed is mistaken. If you look at their policies over the past 2.5 months, with regard to women education, for example, it's completely unacceptable in the 21st century to have a group in common say it that women or girls do not have the right to be educated or don't have the right to go to work. I think we see some shifts in language and in some tactics at the higher echelons of the Taliban leadership. And even that is only among a small number of Taliban leaders. But that is really meant to gain international recognition. We need to just remind ourselves that the last time the Taliban came to power, they secured recognition from only 3 countries: Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. So international recognition was a major issue for them, and they are cognizant of that fact this time around. So they have tried to sort of soften their language, but if you look at their actions have not really changed. They are opposed to women and minority rights, and they're imposing limitations on cultural expression, on art, and on music, which is totally unacceptable in the 21st century.
Talking about recognition of Taliban, really the most countries show little sign that they are going to recognize the Taliban. Would it be a problem for international relations?
I think that almost all regional countries, not only the regional countries, but countries beyond the region, they are in this dilemma of how to deal with the situation in Afghanistan and with the Taliban regime. On the one hand, they have to engage with the Taliban to sort of persuade them to change their ways, in part because they hope that they can, work with the Taliban to fight these other extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. On the other hand, they look at the Taliban actions, and it would be awkward for any government to sort of formally recognize the Taliban. So we see that regional countries are engaging with the Taliban. but at the same time, they are hesitant to formally recognize the Taliban regime, knowing that they cannot trust the Taliban and their words. So I think that the region is trying to find a way to maybe collectively come to a collective decision with regard to the Taliban recognition, but at the same time, everyone is apprehensive about what the recognition of the Taliban might imply for the future behavior of the Taliban. So it's at this point, I think it's a kind of dilemma for almost every region or country in the region.
You have mentioned a refugee crisis that could affect regional and global stability. In fact, thousands of Afghans had to flee their homes, and some of them headed for Europe through Belarus to apply for asylum. But what we see now that Polish and Lithuanian security forces, they are turning away desperate people, and the international organization expressed concern over that. Why are European countries are closing their borders in front of those seeking for protection?
So I really don't have much information about the specific situation at the Polish border and what the specific reasons for which the Polish authorities have decided to not allow refugees to pass through their territory. But more broadly about Europe, I think it's important to note that Europe has been facing with a refugee/migrant crisis over the past 2 decades, which was in part as a result of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in part because of the economic desperation that you see in other countries like Africa. So I think that anti-refugee, anti-migrant sentiments are increasing in European societies, and European politicians have to respond to the situation. So it has put, I think, the European political system under a lot of pressure in various countries. Like they cannot, on the one hand, they have to respond to these crises. On the other hand, they cannot really admit an indifferent number of people into their countries. At the same time, there are political groups within European countries who are trying to take advantage of the negative sentiments against refugees and migrants to gain political power, and we've seen it in different countries. So again, I think this, as for regional countries, for Europe, this is also a dilemma in terms of how to deal with the situation in Afghanistan. This is just one country that is causing, one country out of many that is causing these crises. So we see that European Union is also trying to engage with the Taliban. Although withholding recognition, they are trying to work with the Taliban and try to sort of create a situation inside Afghanistan that at least reduces the flow of migrants and refugees into Europe.
Belarus is being accused of smuggling migrants to Polish and Lithuanian border. Is it reasonable to accuse Belarus of that?
I mean, I don't really know about the specific situation in Belarus. I think there is a limit to what countries can do in these situations. Yes, you have authoritative systems in place in all countries to sort of regulate the flow of refugees and migrants, but at the same time, no government is able to have complete control over the situation. So I imagine that in any country, you can have individuals or groups who can engage in illicit activities, and this happens in almost any country in the world. So in a situation like this, you have desperate people who are trying to flee a situation like Afghanistan, and at the same time, there might be small groups of individuals who try to take advantage of this situation, and this can happen in any country. I'm not an expert on that issue, unfortunately, so I don't know the extent of the problem in Belarus or other countries, but I'm sure it exists and in almost every place. At this point, there are no specific exact statistics on the number of people who have tried to flee but have left to Europe. So many were evacuated by the US and other countries, European countries. At the same time, we know that tens of thousands of people have fled to neighboring countries, Iran and Pakistan. Mm-hmm. So I think you can easily imagine that it's in hundreds of thousands of people have already fled the country, and many more might flee the country if the situation does not improve in Afghanistan.
So thank you very much for your interview, for your expertise. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.